So, without having any other ado, Marta Bertolaso, Human Work and Artificial Intelligence, Between Solitude and Relations. Thank you, Marta.
Well, thank you, Stefano. Thank you, for the organizer and the Pontifical Academy for giving me this possibility. I have slightly changed the title, but probably it's just also just related with English, right? Shall we have the slides on? Thank you very much. Okay. So in this paper, instead of analyzing past causes of current situations, I'm more interested in reasons we can develop in order to build an integral human development through work. This is already a thesis, I would say. This justifies the literature I considered here and the methodology I adopted by focusing on conceptual and explanatory convergences of contemporary understanding of the problems related to work and society. The working hypothesis is that suffering reveals profound truths about being human, truths that seem to be threatened by trends in current technological developments. This also implies that we are clearly facing, as many times in history, I would say, a challenge that can help us to dig into the peculiar epistemological and axiological status of human work and technology. There are facts we have to take into account. The major facts, I would say, that are the massive eruption of automation in the production process, the growing knowledge and information economy that is shaping our societies and social and relationship, the accelerated transmission of data and digital flows. In this scenario, humans easily become or can be considered data that can be collected and organized by machines so that physical, domestic, and social barriers become transparent to this process. Let's think, for example, of the millions of cameras that are recording people's movement and actions in China and in many other workplaces around the world. This also implies that emerging technologies that not only mimic human intelligence but also related to the automation of a scientific discovery pose the question whether even science will be out of the control of human beings at some point. To tackle these scenarios and to discuss them, I will take the path that Pope Francis indicates when says certain way of understanding human life and activity has gone awry to the serious detriment of the world around us. As we will see, the above-mentioned trends reveal a fundamental reduction we have inherited from modern philosophy and social sciences, that is the reduction of our understanding of life and human knowledge to mechanics, so that velocity in the first place, autonomy in a second place, together with an in-principle possible reversibility of processes, have become the axiological reference point of human work too. Humans, in fact, have always changed their environment with work, aided by increasingly effective tools. On the other hand, however, things have happened that have caused work to gradually be conceived more and more in terms of automation. This tendency was already evident 2 centuries ago. Authors in the 60s wrote about the dominance of an autonomous technical society superimposed on human society that has been commanded by it in symbiosis, in conditions that are still largely unpredictable and not seem stoppable. This shift is determined in large part, in my understanding, by the irreversible transition of neo-technical civilization toward automation through the convergence of the cybernetic principle with the mechanical principle and then the substitution by it, with the consequence that the succession of spatially and temporally equivalent events, facts, what we call facts, which is very much related with the reversibility I was mentioning earlier, with their feedback mechanism has become the dominant interpretative perspectives of every human living community-related economic social process of growth and development. Parallel to this convergence, there is the so-called imperialism of exact natural science, mainly understood as an impulse to transform the world into an object, or more precisely, into a thing. This means at the epistemological level that science has been considered more and more a universal and autonomous system of knowledge, with the fundamental parameters and variables that have quickly become the desired result for all human activity, including human work. From a pragmatic point of view, the possibility of theorizing about everything easily reinforced human belief in a completely control of that world. Human work has been thus understood as a means to power and control over nature, including human nature, but not without contradiction, as we know and well represented in this movie. The legacy of the logical positivism reinforced the aforementioned thingified and factual logic that still enjoy, in my opinion, the prerogative of immunity with respect to possible critical analysis, revisions, and interpretation. And our general understanding of human work is somehow within this scenario condemned to a sterile self-referentiality. The modern idea that machines will perform better than humans in the execution of work, in my opinion, precisely follow this kind of cultural agenda. The concept of innovation suffers from this same bias to some extent, in my opinion, especially when reduced and measured in terms of speed. But such mechanistic paradigms lack the epistemological foundations needed to understand which human capacity can still claim an identity on their own that does not derive ultimately from machines and cannot be substituted by them. I'm thinking of experience, observation, sensitivity, the possibility of different interpretation and understandings of reality by humans that have been almost lost, I would say, their value and relevance. Human work in this sense has become a tool, among others, a contingent piece in a necessary and progressive chain, autonomous and self-consistent in itself. But this agenda is showing clearly its limit. The social and anthropological implications of these trends are well described by Han, a philosopher, a Korean philosopher based in Germany at the moment, in one of his now popular texts, The Society of Burnout. Here, of Taylorist functionalism, the professional world and society suffers from performance, hyperactivity, absence of a socially shared direction and goal. Thus, we invest in speed and functional efficiency. This condition is not just about our action, but also about our very selves. Our goal is no longer to get to be humans and up being replaceable pieces of a mechanical chain where the main objective is maturing the capability of being continuously able to do and being everything, what I have called the make-ability paradigm. As Michael Polanyi, the other Polanyi, and Pavel Florensky also stressed, modern man live in this way in lowliness. The tidiness of the society of performance and automation that was mentioned also in the previous talk, reported by Han too, is a solitary tidiness that separates and isolates. And highlight I wanted to make explicit at this point is that automation in this sense and therefore is but a part of the current technical renewal whose main influence on human work is not directed toward change and progress, but just toward speed. So there are other reductions that are, in my opinion, important to understand the current trends that are mainly related with the non-trivial coincidence of autonomy and automation understood as spontaneity. In a thingified world and understanding of the human activity, this coincidence implies, in fact, a reduction of spontaneity to a procedural feature of autonomous actions. The automatists understood as the spontaneism or the new scientific and technical revolution has been changing, in fact, the foundations of work and paved the way to a new relationship between work and social relationship, between work and human responsibility. Examples of this, I think, that can be found, for example, in the by no coincidence reflections, I think, in the recent ethical debates on the use of artificial intelligence technologies that precisely focus on human autonomy, velocity, and efficiency so that you can do better, we can do faster, multiplying possibility of action, without any reflection about decisions, rational decisions, while the human control over machines and the human self-determination have to be guaranteed and protected. And within this paradigm oriented to autonomy, there is another shift that I consider relevant and important for our discussion that is related with our evaluation and maybe very concept of risk. Risk assessment, in fact, are mainly based more on procedural questions than on one of meaning. Recommendations end up mainly being a balanced calculation of risk. Maybe this is not always, but quite often the case, I would say. As a consequence, the evaluation criteria of human work and activity can only be mainly negative. We know which disaster we want to avoid, but we hardly know and we are hardly able to make explicit which words we are really willing to build. The ethical question is contaminated by a bias, which I see as an important hair of the mechanistic positivism, the means and the relationship that follow this structure, mechanistic structure, and that is representing these colored slides. I decided to adopt the colored slides because after lunch I say I don't want to use black and white. The means-end relationship dominates the ethical paradigm centers on autonomy, an essential scheme of what is technical. The means-end relationship is simply, in my opinion, the cause-effect relationship transported onto a different level. And sometimes best practices, the emphasis on best practices, seems to be the only positive and desirable ethical outcome and tool. Authors have related the excess that follows this kind of industrial revolutions with the revolt of the singular against the global, the genealogy of hostility. In my interpretation of what is going on, I think that we can push forward this conclusion, saying that the fundamental problem is not so much hostility as such, but hostility justified by real or presumed autonomies, so that the final result is very much of indifference. So, to be constructive, right, is the question becomes what are we actually losing, right, in this process and transition between these two paradigms, these two ages, right, of our history. I would say that it is the historic dimension of the human work. Rhythms and interaction are relations that bear meaning and change humans by their own building of an environment that becomes part of their identity and history. I think that some of these aspects were already present in the paper that Donati gave. Some contemporary authors refer to similar dynamics, stressing the importance of human dwelling, that we can adopt as a terminology, as a narrative, to the extent that they emphasize the relevance and the importance of the environment, understood in a wider sense, social relationship and so on, and to the extent that it highlights that it is not possible to proceed thinking that everything can be eventually respooled, replaced, etc. That's why I use this way, right, of representing human work, and it's a deep feature with the expression of reciprocity with asymmetry. This means that any time, for example, we approach each other, it is always in a reciprocal way, but is also true that we relate to each other in a spatial and temporal specific context, that is shaping all the time the directionality of our own biographies. The dynamics of such asymmetrical reciprocity imply that every time I give, for example, I must also be open to the possibility of that gift not being accepted, understood, or even it's being refused. It further implies accepting the uncertainty of the many contingent factors that characterize our human life and defining that space more appropriately as a space of gratuitousness. This is a logic that is absent in machines, which instead seek to reduce the space of contingency or manage it in terms of tolerable errors. In human relationship, this reciprocity with asymmetry also prevents the flattening and manipulation of relationship to the point of extortion regarding the freedom and responsibility of others. In this sense, we are always alone, to some extent, in our decisions. But this solitude, quote unquote, safeguards our own space of freedom and that of others to always be able to start again, to align ourselves or not on extended objectives. Once again, this space is something that machines do not know. I thus call such spaces generated by reciprocity with asymmetry dynamics living spaces. living places. These places are what we must create with our work in its relational dimension, that is historical, physical, contingent, cognitive, that is creates knowledge, understanding, and awareness at the same time. In this sense, the question, I think, of the dignity of work also requires a reflection not only on the contents of the specific action, but on the assets it generates and invests in. And I agree with the presentation we heard this morning that human beings can go back to this kind of agenda in a specific sense. Work serves to create worlds in which space and time bear the signature of the meaning humans have always been able to give to their work, the signature of their culture, and of their values that precede the form of recognition of humans in work. We can now ask, what is the most fundamental characteristic of these living places? From a physical point of view, from a temporal, spatial point of view. It is the perspective they are able to create that are usually mediated by interruptions. And here I'm quoting other contemporary authors that says that the contemporary world within the mechanistic paradigm mentioned above fundamentally conceives action as without interruptions. Pure activity only prolongs what already exists, while truly addressing the other presupposes the negativity of interruption. Activity that follows the stupidity of mechanics is poor in interruptions, I'm quoting. Machines cannot turn themselves off. Despite its enormous computing power, the computer is stupid in that it lacks the ability to linger. Moreover, as Harari, for example, states, machines do not see a plurality of opportunities because this can happen only if there is an interruption of processes. This lack of perspective, in my opinion, corresponds to the reduction of the demand on the relation to the one of action, which on the ethical levels justifies the reduction on the demand for ethical responsibility to control of the coefficient of risks and safety. Only by understanding the dynamic stability and unity in which different players, human beings, technology, infrastructures, and so on, have their own place, it is possible to respect the individuality and uniqueness of the living beings, of the human beings, as a source of conceptual wealth and explanatory plurality, to have a deeper understanding of the world around us and of ourselves. The denial of all this leads instead, in my opinion, and justifies that solitary tidiness I was mentioning that divides. It is a tidiness that renders us incapable of looking and therefore of orienting ourselves. It induces mutism and indifference and destroys all commonality, proximity, and even language. And there are consequences, very concrete consequences of this that I can see or recognize in society. On one hand, the lack of interruptions and rhythms and rituals, traditions, impoverishes humans to the point that they no longer know how to use their working time, and quite often, even less, I would say, and going back to some presentation we had yesterday, even less their rest time. We have people with a lot of time and they don't know how to use that time, even less to take care of others or to enjoy beauty or other things. In contemporary society, moreover, these places, the places quite often become iconic. They no longer attract, nor do they change the people who pass by them. And sometimes I think that this is sadly a reality that affects also our homes and our communities, right? What follows from all of this discourse is a double feature of human work dignity, and maybe there are suggestions for actions. On one hand, the fundamental characteristic and privilege of human work can be recognized, in my opinion, in concreteness, understood as the capacity of human beings to mediate between the local and the global, to the extent that humans have a horizon of meaning, a concrete place, and concrete relationships. They err less in relation to reality, however large or small their capacity for observation, abstraction, realization. And I think that this is very true if we think of our family and domestic dynamics sometimes. On the other hand, this also means that a fundamental part of the dignity of work, of human work, passes through the restitution, quote unquote, to workers of the fruit of their work. The highest form of alienation, I think, is the work of those who don't know for whom they are working, or for those who work only for the benefit of others. This puts humans in processes of automation where the only possible action is to perpetuate what was already there. But this excludes the possibility of triggering the dynamics of gifting and gratuitousness, as we can read in the last documents of the last two popes, at least, I would say. It becomes fundamental, therefore, both to personalize work, not so much in the various senses of autonomy described above, but by allowing people as individuals and as a community to enjoy and take care of the world they build with their work that thus become their own shared living place, in which goods, common goods, are embodied. Not because, and we call those goods common goods, not only or not mainly because of their common availability, but because of the common values they embody and bear. Such values act as boundaries, as identities that create a relationship and bridges. They do not block or impose action, but orient it to couple with others and different perspectives. Think of how different are sometimes guidelines and the use we make of guidelines with this respect. Such values act somehow passively, opening up to action a multiplicity of solutions that can be explored precisely for their respect for specificities and identities. In its epistemic, ethical, and axiological dimension, therefore, we can distinguish from a make-ability paradigm, a realize-ability paradigm. The first is dominated and evaluated using mechanic, functionalist, and static parameters. The second, through concreteness, perspective, reciprocity with asymmetry, using relational and historical criteria, able to acknowledge the unity in the multiplicity of differences. And thus, this is just summarizing what we have been saying up to now. And let's just close the presentation, trying to bridge now those sufferings we were talking about at the beginning of my presentation with this idea that emerged across the presentation about solitude. The term solitude, in fact, contains the concept of being separated from others. The etymology of separate, right, parare, refers to the separation of the unborn child from the mother. But in some languages, we do distinguish between good and bad solitude using two different terms. Solitude as being alone, and loneliness, feeling alone in isolation from others. The solitude mentioned in the above parts of my presentation is the bad solitude, isolation and loneliness intended as denial of the desire of the other. It rejects the possibility of opening up towards the others. There are students in my classes that always say that the best way to stay alone is to go to the tube, in which you are immersed in crowd, right? And it's a mess, it's noisy, but you are alone, right? And good solitude, instead, on the other hand, has more to do with silence and the capacity for wonder or admiration, another term that yesterday came out in another presentation. To be silent implies that we have the potential to say something. Being alone, in this sense, solitude, also presupposes the possibility of not being so, of being open to the world. Therefore, humans must move from isolation, loneliness, to good solitude, a moment of silence removed from people's spaces. And I think that here we have an educational challenge. Solitude starts from valuing the relationship with the other and from the desire to relate to the other, while the sense of isolation starts from need. As well known, need only emphasizes or mainly emphasizes the utilitarian aspect of the object, even technology or the others, while value captures the truth of the object, the importance of the other in himself, herself. Therefore, and in the light of the analysis, yeah, I think that we have to invest, right, and to endorse either a society of autonomies or a society of subject of relationships, with their solitudes, of course, maybe new solitudes, but that might be part of this new social environment. Okay, I think that my time is almost finished, so let me just say that, maybe going back and having in mind the presentation we had yesterday from Marco, right, that when we are not able to couple, right, with this concept of relationships and solitude, it's really a difficulty to focus personally or collectively on relevant projects. And when we miss and when we are not able to share relevant projects, we easily become sensitive to everything and too much. We react too soon and too intensively to everything. I would say, and it was written in this way, so I'm just reading at this point, in a frenzy, we also unlearn to anger that becomes simply sterile irritation, reducing relationship to compromises between autonomies. And I think that sometimes the difficulties we have to understand why we are aware of the need for a change, but there is something still missing there, right? There is a driving force that is not in place, is very much related with this aspect. And to close my presentation, some morals. I won't spend time on these first 2 or 3 points because we already presented them, but let me just make explicit a thesis of my presentation of my paper, which is that difficulties in dealing with the problem of raised by technologies relate mainly to an inherited, distorted notion of human work that also, in fact, affects our relationships with the technology, and not the other way around. I know that this thesis can be questioned and discussed, but I'm happy and open to that. Thank you.